What's up guys, welcome back to the channel, and today I'm back with another video where this time once again, we're going to look at two of the greatest players of all time, that being Kobe Bryant, as well as Wilt Chamberlain. And in this video, we're going to compare their two best career games, that being Kobe's 81-point game and Wilt's 100-point game. And it just so happens these two games are the highest scoring games in NBA history. So with that being the case, let's compare the two and see the better overall game, Kobe or Wilt. And first up, we'll look at Kobe's 81-point game from the 2006 season. Now, to give some overall context coming into this game, the Lakers were a mediocre playoff team that were 7th in the West with a 21-19 record. Kobe at this point was averaging 34.8 points per game, the most of his career, and the most in the NBA. And on this night, they were playing the Toronto Raptors, who were 14-26, they were 29th in defensive rating, and 29th in opponents' points per game. So really coming into this game was a battle of two mediocre teams with one superstar, that being Kobe Bryant. Now in this game for Kobe, his grandma actually attended this game, her first one ever, and it was being played on his grandfather's birthday. Also by weird coincidence, this is Kobe's 666th career game. Now versus Toronto in this game, Kobe, as you guys know, had 81 points, 6 boards, 3 steals, 2 assists on 61% shooting. He made 7 threes and shot 90% from the line. And LA won this game by 18 points. So from a scoring standard, this game was absolutely phenomenal, and the efficiency definitely takes it over the top compared to some other all-time great performances. But if you really want to know how great this game was, you have to look in depth and really dig for the stats. Kobe in this game had 55 points in the second half, that is the second most in NBA history. In the fourth quarter, he had 28 points, again the second most, and on his Lakers team, he had no teammate score over 15 points, and the bench combined for a measly 5 points. And when you compare the Raptors starters to Kobe, he actually outscored them 81-80. And in this game, he became the second player ever to have 60 points and 5+ threes. Also in this game, he had the second highest box plus minus at 33.6, and the second highest game score at 63.5. And looking at the actual game on the court, Kobe's Lakers actually were down by 18 points in the third quarter, but Kobe in that quarter had 27, and in the fourth quarter, 28. And in the final 24 minutes, he outscored Toronto by himself 55-41. And in the second half, he had all but 18 points for his Lakers team. And when talking about this game for Toronto, the one player who gets memed relentlessly is Jalen Rose.
Drink, Mr. Bryant?
Yeah, I'll have a vodka martini.
How many olives would you like?
81.
Really?
Nah, man, I'm just playing. Just 2.
But if you actually break it down by scoring on opponents, Jalen Rose actually had 18 points scored on him. Mo Peterson had 17, Mike James had 6, Joey Graham had 7, Matt Bonner had 5, and so on. So Kobe gave a healthy dose of points to everyone on Toronto. It wasn't just one person, as the Raptors had nobody who could guard him. And once again, speaking of Jalen Rose, here's his thoughts on Kobe's 81-point game and what he was thinking in the moment.
When you huddle up with Mike and Mo, what did you guys say to each other?
We suck. We're idiots. How do we let that happen? Why didn't we clothesline that guy? But you know what? All of that is a tribute to the respect that we have for Kobe. Because if he would have been taunting in any way, shape, or form, it would have all went different. When you're going against a guy like that, there are going to be historic nights. And it's not like Luke Walton scored 20 on me. Like, if that would have happened, I would have buried my head in the sand.
So when we're looking at the 81-point game, it's more than the points, it's the overall context, the stories, the player anecdotes, that makes it all that more special. And I think overall this game is undoubtedly one of the best games of all time. And speaking of great games, let's look at Wilt's 100-point game from 1962. And giving some overall background context, Wilt coming into this game was playing for the Warriors, but a 47-29 record, which was in the playoffs, and was averaging 50.2 points per game, the highest of his career, and by far the most in the NBA. His opponents, the 26-win Knicks, with the 4th worst defensive rating and the 4th worst opponent's points per game. Now looking a little bit deeper in this game, Wilt's team had to wait 6 hours to play in the stadium, and to pass the time, they played arcade games where Wilt was apparently on fire and winning everything. And one last thing, coming into this game, Wilt had already had 3 straight 60-point games, and he was definitely in that rhythm and finding his groove. And when looking at the overall stats for this game, Wilt, of course, he had 100 points, he had 25 boards, 2 assists, on 57% shooting, 28 for 32 from the line, and his team won by 22 points, and he played all 48 minutes. And I think for Wilt's 100-point game, shooting 28 for 32 from the line, that's some Steph Curry type stuff, and for Wilt to do that is pretty remarkable. Now, also going more in depth, Wilt in this game had 41 points in the first half, the 6th most ever. He had 59 points in the second half, the most in NBA history. He had no teammate score over 20, and his bench combined for 9 points. Also, Wilt outscored New York starters 191. Like I said before, Wilt made 28 free throws, the most in NBA history. And by playing 48 minutes and scoring 50 plus points, he became the first player since George Mikan to do so in a game. Now, unfortunately, back in the 60s, stats like blocks, game score, block plus minus, they weren't being kept, and we don't have Wilt's numbers for the stat categories. But once again, for some overall context, here's a few stories from Wilt himself talking about this game in Hershey, Pennsylvania.
So big, got 100 points against us. And then I kind of like fall back to sleep again, and then I wake up again, and they spent the whole trip talking about the 100 points and how I should be ashamed of myself what I did to them.
Really embarrassing.
Yeah, you know. And so when I got to my apartment, they let me off. I said to them, "Hey, thanks, guys, but I'm really sorry about that 100 points. I didn't really mean it." You know.
People say Wilt team, they say 100 points. So I would guess this is the biggest game, you know, that I ever had.
Oh, I was just so glad they did it to somebody else and not us. Oh, I said, boy, that could have been me. Because he was that talented.
So that right there was the overall summary of Wilt's 100-point game and Kobe's 81-point game. Now for the best part of this video, let's compare the two and see the better overall performance. And to do so, we have to cross-compare eras, which can be tricky. So to kind of combat that, let's go to the eras differences and add even more context to these games. So looking at 2006, the NBA had a pace of 90.5 as the 5th lowest in NBA history. At this time, defenses were much more competitive than 1960s, as during Wilt's season, teams averaged 118.8 points per game, the highest in NBA history. So already off the bat, there's some major differences, as Kobe's era was far more defensive, and offenses weren't nearly as explosive. Now looking at both these games individually, in Wilt's game, the Warriors shot 115 times. In Kobe's game, the Lakers shot 88 times. A pretty big gap in shot attempts, which is pretty important to note, and you have to remember that when evaluating these games. Also in Wilt's 100-point game, he scored 59% of his team's points. In Kobe's game, he scored 66%. So from an overall perspective, Kobe had more of an impact on his game scoring compared to his era than Wilt had. And looking at both these players' games, Wilt shot 17 more times than Kobe and shot 4% less from the field. So for comparison's sake, let's say Kobe Bryant played in Wilt Chamberlain's era and played at his pace and his scoring rate. In that scenario, Kobe would have taken 19 more shots and 11 more free throws. If you adjust Kobe's 81-point game to Wilt's era, he would have had 107 total points with threes. Without threes, he would have had 99, only one short of Wilt. So you may be thinking, why am I bringing this up and why does this matter? And it's pretty simple. As NBA eras, they can be vastly different, some can be better, and some can be worse. And when looking at the mid-2000s compared to the early 60s, those two eras are about as different as you can get. Now also comparing these two games, in Kobe's game, the Lakers are down by 18 points in the third quarter, and they needed all of Kobe's 81 points to win that game. If you go back and watch the film, Kobe's scoring, it felt natural and it felt in rhythm. It wasn't being forced, and he was not stat padding. Now unfortunately for Wilt, that is not the case, as in the fourth quarter his teammates were intentionally finding the Knicks to get the ball back to Wilt so he could score 100. That right there for stat padding standards is a different level, and for today's NBA, that would simply never happen as fans would go absolutely berserk at that level of stat padding. And luckily for Wilt, this game was not on television and not recorded. And I think if it was, a lot of NBA fans would have a problem with stat padding and how forced his 100 points was. So when taking everything into account, the overall stats, the context, the in-depth stats, the advanced stats, looking at both players' eras, I think when it comes down to it, Kobe Bryant had a better overall game compared to Wilt Chamberlain. And I think why I chose Kobe's game is his era was much tougher than the 1960s from a defense perspective as well as offensive. And from my own personal view, I absolutely despise and hate stat padding. And for Wilt that game in the fourth quarter, that's all he did and all his team did. So in conclusion, I think Kobe, his 81-point game, is more impressive and better than Wilt's 100-point game. As always, thank you guys for watching. I really enjoyed it. I'll see you guys next time.